If you watched the last video segment, you found that the working conditions, the low rate of pay, and the just absolute insanity of the pace of the work literally ground people up and spat them out. And when you lost your job, it was devastating to not only you, but your family as well. And for those of you that have pushed on in the jungle, you understand that it's not a very happy story, that even despite virtually every member of the Rutgers family working, they cannot manage to make ends meet. It's a very depressing story, and it's depressing for a reason. Sinclair had a very specific purpose in writing it. But I want you to think about something else for a second. When we get weather in North Texas, when it rains, all that water goes somewhere. There's not standing water in the streets. Mosquitoes can't breed in it. People can't fall in it and hurt themselves, slip on the ice, whatnot. And part of the reason that we can assume that that's not really going to be that devastating of an occurrence is because we've got things like sewers. You need to understand that Packingtown, Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, wherever it is that you're talking about, was a very dangerous place to live. And the reason that the urban areas of the United States were so dangerous was because there was virtually no codes for safety. There were no fire codes. There were no codes that said that you couldn't pack 20 people in a single bedroom apartment. There were no codes that said that fire departments had to put out fires. There were no codes that said that cities had to set up sewer systems. As you can imagine, all of this had consequences, and it made places like Packingtown a very dangerous place to live. To really emphasize this point, I want you to turn to page 67 of the Jungle. On page 67, which is in the middle of chapter 7, there's a paragraph that starts out, "There were many such dangers." Find that paragraph. It's toward the top of the page. "There were many such dangers in which the odds were all against them. Their children were not as well as they had been at home," meaning the Rutgers children. "But how could they know that there was no sewers to their houses, and that the drainage of 15 years was in a cesspool under it? How could they know that the pale blue milk that they bought around the corner was watered down and doctored with formaldehyde besides?" Now, let's tease some of these things out. First of all, there is no sewers, so everything that people do, and I'll let your imagination, go to work with that, animals do, all that's virtually standing in the street. Imagine the diseases that are breeding in it. So it's a very unhealthy place to live. Furthermore, when you take a sip of milk, generally speaking, you expect it to be very white, right? Well, milk wasn't white during this period. It was blue, and it was blue because there was no law that said that you couldn't put a bunch of chemicals in that milk that would make it more attractive from the perspective of a consumer, meaning it would keep for longer, it would last you for longer. Well, what choice do you have when there isn't any such thing as a protective agency such as the central government that's looking out for people of this particular variety? So the physical attributes of Packingtown, it was dirty, it was disease-filled, it didn't lend itself very well to the idea of freedom. It makes you think of whether or not we're free. Now, let me push this envelope a little bit further. The beginning of chapter 10, which in this particular edition starts out on page 92, if you go down to the bottom of that page, it talks about how Packingtown smelled. Now keep in mind, this is a meatpacking town. It's a place where animals go to die. So again, let your imagination do the work. There's a paragraph that starts out that when springtime came, they were delivered. They're talking about the animals. Go toward the bottom of the page, about four lines from the bottom. There's a sentence that starts out, "Later came midsummer." Do you see that? "Later came midsummer, with the stifling heat and the dingy killing floor of Anderson's became a very purgatory. Once there were 3 men fell dead from sunstroke in a single day. All day long the rivers of hot blood poured forth until, with the sun beating down and the air motionless, the stench was enough to knock a man down. All the old smells of a generation would be drawn out by this heat, for there was never any washing up at Anderson's, and the walls and rafters were caked with the filth of a lifetime." Now, again, let's think about this. The area in which you live, the area in which you work, is actually harmful to your health. You can get a lot of nasty, nasty diseases simply by breathing the air. It doesn't smell very good. Again, it's not very conducive to the idea of freedom. But furthermore, think about what they're doing, what their job is, which is to prepare food. If the workforce is exceptionally dirty and the factory in which the food is produced is exceptionally dirty, what makes you think that the food that you eat is not exceptionally dirty? Again, it gets into the idea of American freedom. Now, there's one more example that I want to share with you when it comes to the physical place in which these people were living. Turn to page 192, which is the beginning page of chapter 22. This is a very tragic tale, and it'll tug at your heart, but it also exemplifies exactly how and why the streets of Chicago, Packingtown in particular, were so dangerous. If you've read up to this point, you know that Jurgis's son, little Anatas, has an accident. And I want to take you through that accident. There's a point toward the top of that page, 192 that is, where Jurgis is asking a question. He says, how does this happen? He's talking about his son's accident. He says, how does this happen, he asked. Maria scarcely heard him in her agony. He repeated the question louder yet and more harshly. He fell off the sidewalk, she wailed. This sidewalk in front of the house was a platform made of half-rotten boards about 3 feet above the level of the sunken street. How did he come to play there? She demanded. He went out. He went out to play, Maria sobbed, her voice choking her. We couldn't make him stay in. He must have got caught in the mud. Are you sure he is dead? He demanded. Oh, yes, she wailed. We called a doctor. Do you understand what's happening? This is a school child, somebody that should have been in school, but because school was not mandatory for children of that age at that particular time, it meant that they went on to play in the streets of Chicago without any adult supervision. What's happening in that scene is Jurgis's son drowned in a cesspool. I mean, first of all, imagine dying like that, drowning in general, let alone in a cesspool. Now, keep in mind that these are people that are basically forced to live in those conditions. If you're forced to live in a place that's unhealthy, just simply breathing the air, if you're forced to live in a place that's dangerous, that if you walk off your front porch, you have the possibility of drowning, that doesn't lend itself very well to the idea of American freedom. Now, there's something that I think I would connect this with if I were you, that this isn't just in Chicago. If you read a document in your big blue book that's entitled How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, you're going to hear a very similar story. Now, Riis is talking about the dumbbell tenements in New York City, so that's beneficial in and of itself, that you can emphasize to your reader, this isn't just happening in Chicago, it's happening elsewhere. Pittsburgh, New York, Detroit, all over the place. But what Riis demonstrates in that book is that because there weren't any housing codes, people were forced to live in these rooms without windows, without any light, without any ventilation. And if you think about this for a second, in the middle of the late fall or early winter, when things are dark, they're damp, they're cold, there's not a lot of ventilation, again, it's a breeding ground for death and disease. There are a lot of people, and he points this out in his work, there's a lot of people that simply suffocated because of the lack of regulation in the housing industry. Now, I'll conclude with this thought. How likely are you to thrive and achieve the American dream, freedom, equality, if you don't know whether or not you're going to be able to survive because places in which you live are so very dangerous? Think about that as you consider this question.